Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony Moreno, and I work on policy here at ALI. Welcome to our sixth and last panel of the day. Last but not least, thank you for sticking around with us thus far, and I hope you have been enjoying these sessions as much as I have. This session topic is titled Beliefs About Fishes and Their Relation to Animal Positive Behaviors in Brazil, Canada, China, and India. This is the last panel capping off our theme for the day on neglected research areas and species. So just a few quick housekeeping reminders for our attendees. This session will last 45 minutes and we will open up time at the end for questions and answers. As with all of our panels, all attendees in this session are muted with cameras off. Also, please post your questions in the Q&A box or chat below if you're on Zoom, or if you're on the Whova app, feel free to post questions there. This session is also being recorded and streamed live on Facebook. And lastly, we expect respectful and productive discussions and have a zero tolerance policy for harassment and discrimination of any kind. With that said, I would like to introduce our speaker for this session, Zach Wulderk. Zach is a research scientist at Faunalytics, where he works to build capacity in the animal advocacy movement using research and data. He has a background in economics and political science and is an art devotee. So welcome to Zach, and that's it for me. Zach, would you like to go ahead and get started for us?
Sure, thank you, Anthony. I'm just going to share my screen here. Hopefully everybody can see that.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, so thanks so much, Anthony, and to the Aquatic Life Institute for having me. It's been really great to listen to all the panels and talks and to be listed on the same agenda as so many people doing really interesting and important work. Like Anthony said, my name is Zach Wulderk. I'm a research scientist at Faunalytics, and I'm going to be talking today about the results from a forthcoming report, or really a series of reports on beliefs about fishes and their relation to animal positive behaviors, with a focus on Brazil, Canada, China, and India. So first, a little background on this work. In 2020, Faunalytics released a report exploring the same topic, but surveying the US public. And I should say that both that report and forthcoming reports also cover beliefs about chickens, but since this is the Aquatic Life Conference, I'll just be focusing on the fish side of things. This is a replication of that US study, this time collaborating with Mercy for Animals and surveying Brazil, Canada, China, and India. In 2018, almost 100 million tons of live fishes were slaughtered. Live fish tonnage, because that number comes from the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, which reports live weight rather than number of individual fishes. But more than a fifth of that total comes from the countries that we cover in these reports, and then I'm going to cover in this talk. And then if you add the US in as well from the first report we put out, that's more than a quarter of that total. As I'm sure everybody's aware, a lot of research tends to focus on the US and European context, but not only are there incredibly important differences between parts of the world that make it tricky to apply the lessons learned in one country or region to other countries, but Brazil, Canada, China, India, they're all big time contributors to global animal slaughter totals. For example, China has the highest fish slaughter totals in the world, and India has the fourth highest. So for these studies, we surveyed about 1,000 participants each from Brazil, Canada, China, and India. And we asked participants about just over 30 beliefs that they might hold about fishes. So these are potentially common beliefs people might have. Some examples of those are listed on this slide. So fish can feel positive emotions like pleasure. Individual fish don't have unique characteristics. Fish can feel stress. Water quality isn't important to fish. Many of the farms that produce fish have horrible living conditions. So the participants were asked about a mix of beliefs that were framed in a few different ways. And for each of those beliefs, we asked folks to rate their level of agreement with the statement that they were shown, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Each of those beliefs can also fit into a broader group or type of belief. So for example, the belief that fish can learn is related to intelligence, and the belief that fish can feel pain is related to suffering. So in total, there were 7 different groups of beliefs beliefs about intelligence and suffering, as well as consumption, emotions, personality, the social nature of fishes, and other beliefs. And those other beliefs are sort of a catch-all that includes things like fish are gross or fish are contaminated with plastics, heavy metals, and chemicals. Each of the specific beliefs that we asked about falls into one of these categories, and then the categories let us consider which types of beliefs might be the most important in addition to the specific beliefs. After we asked about beliefs, we asked participants if they would sign a petition for better living and slaughter conditions for fish, and if they would be willing to sign a pledge to reduce their fish consumption. Since it's unlikely that a petition would be used in the Chinese context, we replaced that with a more general question that was just, do you support improving the quality of life of fish? So we then calculated the correlations between each belief and these pro-fish asks, so petition signature, diet pledge, or in China, the general support question. And those correlations let us know how associated each belief is with a specific outcome. So, for example, do people who tend to believe that fish can learn also tend to sign a fish welfare petition? Before diving into some of the more detailed results for each country, I just wanted to show the high-level uptake numbers for pledges and petitions. So you can see that more people pledged to reduce their fish consumption in China and India than in Canada, and that Brazil is sort of between the two, but a little bit closer to China and India with that 61%. And the same thing is true for petitions. You can see that in each one of these countries, people were also slightly more willing to sign a welfare petition than they were to take the diet pledge. So Brazil 69 versus 61, Canada 44 versus 39, China we didn't ask the petition question, and then India 75 versus 72. So not huge differences, but still a pretty consistent trend there across countries. So now I'm going to just go a little bit deeper into each country's results. Over 60% of people took pro-fish actions in Brazil. So that's the welfare petition and the diet pledge. That's 69% of people signing the fish welfare petition and 61% of people pledging to reduce their consumption of fish. So overall, it's more than 2/3 of participants willing to sign a welfare petition without any specific messaging trying to convince them to do so. That suggests that advocates working in Brazil could see a pretty substantial amount of uptake for petitions. And at 61% for pledges, more than half of participants were willing to reduce their fish consumption, which is also a pretty considerable level. So which beliefs had the strongest correlations with taking a fish diet pledge? People who believe that many fish farms have horrible living conditions, that fish can feel pain, and that fish can feel negative emotions like fear were all more likely to reduce their fish consumption. People who believe fish have unique personalities were also more likely to take the diet pledge. If we look at the average correlation by the types of beliefs that I was mentioning earlier, beliefs about emotions, suffering, and personality had the strongest correlations with taking the diet pledge. And then looking at the petition results, the beliefs with the strongest correlations were that fish can feel pain, that fish need room to explore and exercise, and that fish can feel positive emotions like pleasure. And at the higher group level, beliefs about emotions and suffering had the strongest correlations with signing the welfare petition. So for both the pledge and the petition, emotions and suffering might be the types of beliefs for advocates to focus on, but you can also see that in the individual beliefs, fish farm conditions, for example, is correlated with signing the pledge, but doesn't show up for signing the petition. So there are different beliefs associated with each one of these outcomes. In Canada, pro-fish actions were a little less common. Less than half of the people were willing to sign the petition, which, like in Brazil, was still more popular than the diet pledge. Only 39% of Canadian participants were willing to reduce their consumption of fish. So in Brazil, advocates might have a decent chance of getting a signature or pledge, even with little messaging, because they're both of those numbers were above 60%. But somewhere like Canada might require a little bit more in the way of pro-fish communication. So what might be included in that communication? I say might because correlation doesn't equal causation, right? So we can't say for sure from these beliefs that beliefs are driving actions, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. But the beliefs with the strongest correlations with taking the diet pledge were that fish can feel positive emotions like pleasure, that fish are loving, that big fish farms are gross, and that fish are more intelligent than they're given credit for. And then at the higher level of types of beliefs related to emotions, the social aspects of fishes, and personality were most strongly correlated with taking the diet pledge. For petitions, the strongest associations were that fish can feel positive emotions like pleasure, which is also a top belief for the pledge, and that fish can learn. And then at the group level, emotions are sort of catch-all other group of beliefs, and personality beliefs have the strongest correlations. And in this case, the other group is mostly driven by the belief that fish are beautiful. So by emphasizing some of the beliefs that I mentioned here, advocates in Canada might be able to have more success in getting people to adopt pro-fish behaviors. Another possibility here is for advocates to try stacking their asks. So with the caveat that you need to be careful not to overload people with too many requests. People often show a preference for behavior consistency. So following up a successful ask for a petition signature, for example, with an ask for a diet pledge might lead to a higher rate of diet pledges. For China, we saw a much different response than we did in Canada. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, petitions aren't likely to get used much in the Chinese context, so we asked folks if they generally support improved quality of life for fish, and found that 97% of participants do. In case anybody's interested, that number was similarly high for chickens. I think it was 98%. We also had almost 3 out of 4 people saying they would reduce their fish consumption. And again, this comes after a series of questions about beliefs about fish, but no specific messaging trying to increase people's willingness to take a pledge. So the baseline level of fish attitudes is pretty high. I don't want to spend time on the correlations with that overall sort of general support question because it's nearly unanimous already at 97%. But for the diet pledge, the strongest correlations were with the belief that fish can bond with humans, that fish are curious, and fish are loving. And then the groups with the strongest average correlation with the pledge were beliefs related to emotions, personality, or fish's social nature. You can find more breakdowns by participant, like traits or characteristics, in the reports once they're released, probably early in the new year at the latest. But I wanted to make note of one difference that I thought was pretty interesting, which is that people who were companion animal guardians, aka pet owners, had much higher rates of taking the fish diet pledge. So 85% of companion animal guardians said that they would take the fish pledge, compared to only 53% of people without companion animals. Still a majority, but a pretty noticeable difference there. So that's just another piece of information for advocates to keep in mind when considering their approaches. And then last but not least, India. We saw about 3/4 of Indian participants taking the fish diet pledge and signing the welfare petition. So the baseline willingness to take pro-fish actions in India appears to be pretty high already, which is fantastic. But something else we found was that correlations between beliefs and pro-fish actions were pretty consistently weak. For example, there were no beliefs statistically significantly associated with signing the fish petition, and only a handful associated with the diet pledge. So it's kind of hard to say for sure why this was the case. There's a chance it was something language related, which we discussed a little bit more in the report. But the takeaway here is that since beliefs might not be as important in the Indian context, advocates there might want to evaluate their own successes to figure out which approaches have the greatest impact. But they should also keep in mind that many people are already willing to take pro-fish actions when they're asked, right? 72% of people took the diet pledge and 75% of people signed the petition. And another point I want to touch on quickly is that in India, even though there are some common pro-fish beliefs, like 86% of people believe that fish can feel pain, some beliefs weren't particularly common. Most beliefs really were under 2/3 agreement. So for example, only about half of participants believe that fish need room to explore and exercise. And similarly, a slight majority actually believes that fish don't have unique characteristics. So there's some opportunity for advocates there to sort of like talk more about those aspects of fish. And some upcoming work that Faunalytics is doing. First on these reports, they'll be coming out in the next couple of months, probably early next year. and will contain a lot of detailed information you can dig into. I touched on some of it here, but there's a lot more to go into in the reports themselves. We're also working on translating them into Brazilian Portuguese, simplified Chinese, and Hindi. And if you're interested, we released a report in 2018 on attitudes and behavioral differences related to farm animals in the BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So some overlap there in terms of countries. I mentioned earlier that correlation doesn't equal causation, so we can't say that these differences in beliefs are what's driving people's behavior, but that's sort of a yet, because we're going to be running an experiment in the next few months with a US sample that will provide some insight into whether these beliefs are a cause of pro-fish and pro-chicken behavior, or if they're just associated with them. And we've got another report on the retention of vegans and vegetarians coming out shortly, which is going to look at people's motivations for starting those diets, how their motivations relate to their success, and their levels of speciesism at the beginning and end of sort of their first 6 months. And in the next couple of months, we'll also be releasing a report on the relative effectiveness of different types of advocacy when it comes to pro-animal behaviors. So for example, protests, leaflets, and so on, and how they affect things like consumption. That's all for me. So thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much to the Aquatic Life Conference for having me. I'm happy to take any questions people might have now, but also feel free to email me at zach@faunalytics.org, Zach with an H. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that, Zach. Very insightful presentation. We have a decent amount of questions so far, so I think we could just hop into our Q&A. Let's see. So the first question is, have you found any specific opportunities or setbacks from doing this research in the countries you decided to study?
Yeah, so we were really lucky to be able to work with Mercy for Animals. They have really great people on the ground in these countries, and that's made it definitely a lot easier than it would have been without them. I can say one example of kind of a setback is the case of India. I mentioned that there may have been sort of a language component to the weak correlations that we found there. And you know, in India, there are like a massive number of languages spoken. And we conducted our survey in English after consulting with a researcher in India there. But English is not the first language of a lot of people. It's the first language of like 1%, I believe, of people in India. And so people taking the survey, even if they spoke English, which of course we did screening and everything to make sure that people were understanding the questions, but still may have been, you know, a second or third language for a lot of the people taking the survey. So there's barriers like that are a little bit tricky that we're still figuring out. But luckily, again, with the help of the Mercy for Animals folks on the ground in those countries, we were able to get a lot of sort of input on making sure that the questions we were asking were appropriate to the local context and like input on language and things like that.
Great. So the second question is, what actions do you think advocates can take based on your research?
Yeah, so it depends on which country the advocate is working in and possibly on like what their ask is. And more detailed info on that is like in each of the reports that'll be coming out. But there are a few recommendations we can make that don't necessarily apply to every country we surveyed, but generally could potentially be helpful. So obviously trying to include the beliefs that have the strongest associations with pro-fish actions in your messaging would be a great place to start. I also mentioned stacking your asks. So following up one ask that someone says yes to with another might get you a higher uptake. In India and Brazil in particular, advocates could also consider just asking people to sign a welfare petition or take a diet pledge, because those countries had pretty high baseline levels of pro-animal action. So there's definitely an opportunity there for advocates to just ask, because they might get a decent amount of uptake.
Great. And our next question is, can you say more about what kinds of beliefs are captured by the emotions group? And what is emotions in this context more specifically?
Yeah, so the term emotions is like those 7 categories that I had listed are just we brought more broadly categorized each one of the individual beliefs into those categories to make it sort of easier to say, okay, well, if I don't want to specifically talk about the belief that fish can learn, more broadly, I want to just be speaking about like fish intelligence, because that might be a little bit easier to target in that sort of higher level rather than being hyper specific in what you're trying to talk about. That's where those sort of names came from, right? So they're just sort of shorthand, I guess, for what type for like kind of clustering these types of beliefs. The emotion questions that we asked were fish can feel, or beliefs that we asked people to sort of agree or disagree with are fish can feel stress, fish can feel positive emotions like pleasure, and fish can feel negative emotions like fear.
Our next question
And then
is,
I guess,
sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry, I just looking at the question again in the chat, the suffering questions tend to be more about like the conditions under which they're suffering. So being raised inhumanely at fish farms, being overcrowded, being in a barren environment or something like that. Definitely they're connected. And in some of the future research that we're planning on doing, I think we may be able to sort of like tease that out a little bit more. But that's sort of the kind of the difference between those 2 categories.
Great, thanks for that. And let's see, are there any findings that you found that surprised you or shocked you during this?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting just the differences between countries in the level of willingness to sign the petition or take the pledge. I think the very high rates in China and India, and just how different those were from the rates in Canada, for example. The Canadian results were pretty similar to the U.S. results in a lot of ways, which wasn't super surprising. But it is really interesting to see how different those numbers are kind of across countries, and also the low rates of correlations in, what I should say, that the weakness of the correlations in India was also pretty interesting. You know, I think there's definitely a lot of room for researchers to explore what other sort of factors besides beliefs might play into things, but it is interesting to see where beliefs might be more associated with these actions.
Great. And our next question is, what small-bodied animals should we target based on tractability?
Yeah, so this is a tough one because the answer is sort of, it depends. I don't think there's like a single clean answer. Faunalytics has a page on our website that has global animal slaughter statistics, both in total and by country and per capita. And if you look at those numbers, you can see just how many fish and chickens are slaughtered worldwide each year. But after zeroing in on those animals, because the numbers are so high, it's a bit different based on country. So just basing, giving an answer based on the results in these studies, in Canada and India, there wasn't a big difference between people's willingness to take a diet pledge or sign a petition for chickens versus fishes. So they might be similarly tractable there. In China, slightly more people took the chicken pledge than the fish pledge. So chickens might be slightly more tractable in China. And then in Brazil, petition rates were similar between chickens and fishes, but the fish pledge had a lot more uptake than the chicken pledge did. So in Brazil, it might depend on what your goal is. If you're taking a more sort of like institutional approach and using petitions, or if you're working maybe on more the individual level and trying to reduce consumption.
Right. And so our next question is, why do you think the pledges in India and China, and the petitions in India, had such a good reaction? And I guess on the other hand, what do you think it was about Canada where there was a discrepancy between the countries that you measured? One of the things you think of in when you take a sociology class, they tell you, Western countries are a bit more individualistic. Eastern and Southern countries tend to be a little bit more collectivist. Could that play a factor? Maybe diet or their diet or things like that. How can you say anything about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the short answer is I'm not totally sure, and it's definitely worth looking into more. We asked a bunch of different sort of like demographic and diet questions, about what people ate. Like for example, I talked about people who are companion animal guardians and things like that. So there's some information to be gleaned from that, but actually not as much as you would expect. I think there's a decent chance that it is a sort of a more broad kind of cultural difference. People's willingness to say yes to things is certainly possible. Like I said, the U.S. Results and the Canadian results were not super different, and obviously, as like bordering countries with relatively similar cultures, that's not super surprising. But it's still interesting to see. So I do think that there's probably some sort of cultural aspect underlying it. Of course, there's also differences in people's ability to actually take those actions. But yeah, I think the cultural difference is probably what's underpinning it. But it's definitely something I'd like to explore in future research.
Great. And let's see. Has the report had any feedback or exposure in Brazil, Canada, China, and India?
Yeah, so we haven't released them yet, but we worked with, like I mentioned before, with Mercy for Animals in sort of designing the survey and making sure that it was appropriate in each of those contexts. For Canada in particular, a lot of the Faunalytics staff is Canadian, so we definitely have some Canadian input on the reports there. But we also shared worked with some folks that again are on the ground in each of these countries for Mercy for Animals, who have like provided some feedback on the report. So we've gotten input from them, but we haven't released the reports yet. So nothing just yet in terms of like a broader audience response.
Right. And when the reports are released, or if you have already, is there any specific call to action for, actually, I think I read the question wrong. Do the petitions and pledges have any specific call to action for the participants?
Yeah, so I can tell you exactly what the petition and pledge questions said. So for the pledge, we said that in recent years, a lot of people have begun to reduce how much fish they eat, and that's a pattern that is expected to continue. Will you pledge to reduce your own fish consumption? And then we make it very clear in the question for both the pledge and the petition that that's not going to have any effect on the payment of the people who are taking the survey. So it's just an additional question if they want to answer it. And the petition is, we say we'd like to give you the opportunity to sign a petition that would encourage legal reforms to improve the lives of fish. Specifically, it's designed to build support for regulations that would ensure that fish farms have better living and slaughter conditions. Would you be willing to sign this petition? So that's it. There isn't any sort of like go vegan or anything along those lines. It's just, this is what the petition is, or this is what the idea behind the pledge is. Do you want to do this? It won't have any effect on whether or not you get any sort of payment.
Right. And let's see. Next question is, can you tell us about how many people were asked and how many people were selected to participate in these surveys, and how much did it vary? Was there a vary between countries, or do you guys try to have a similar amount for each country?
Yeah, it's a similar amount for each country. It's about 1,000 people per country. I think it's closer to maybe 900 in India, ultimately, after data cleaning. But it's about 1,000 people in each country, and that's split into two because even though I focus mostly on the fish aspect here, we did fish and chicken, so randomly assigned half of each of those 1,000 people to either chickens or fish conditions.
So our next question is, are you looking for any more countries to do this study in? Yeah.
Yeah, at the moment, this is we're turning to some other sort of types of research related to chickens and fishes. I definitely wouldn't be opposed to doing it in the future. We'd have to sort of incorporate that into like our research prioritization process. I definitely think it would be useful if, you know, we put all of our materials up online for everyone to see. So if there's any people who are interested in replicating these studies in other countries, that would be fantastic. I'd love to see it. Obviously, even though most of these countries are pretty big contributors to, you know, the total number of fish and chickens slaughtered worldwide, it's not all of them. And I do think that it's important to get that sort of country-specific data so that advocates working in those countries can tailor it. So there's nothing in the plans just yet, but I do think that it would be really interesting.
Great. Yeah, I think it would as well. So I think we answered a good amount of questions. I think we could wrap it up there. A big thank you to Zach, and a thank you to all of our attendees for joining us for this session. Please keep your eye out for post-conference communications on ways you can continue to be involved in protecting aquatic animals. Please join us tomorrow on our last day of the Aquatic Life Conference, where our theme will be on sustainability, conservation, and food systems, and intersectionality. Also, feel free to follow us on social media and visit ali.fish for more information. Thank you for joining us for this panel, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.